If you open a map and trace your finger over the planet, what looks like ink on paper is actually destiny written in rock and water. Geography is not some quaint backdrop to history, it's the silent rulebook. The rivers, mountains, coastlines, and plains don't just shape where people live. They shape how nations feed themselves, defend themselves, and connect to the rest of the world. That's why when you hear arguments about whether a country will rise or fall, the first question I always ask is, what does the land itself allow that country to do? Think about the earliest great societies, settlements by rich rivers that reliably flooded and fed whole populations. Those rivers didn't just provide food, they organized transport, law, religion, and trade. Egypt, for example, grew out of the Nile's predictable floods and the protection of deserts on either side. That combination created a remarkably stable civilization that endured for millennia. The Nile was not just a river, it was a calendar, a highway, and a wall. That's why when we still talk about Egypt today, it's not just the pyramids or the pharaohs that fascinate us, but the sheer longevity of a system built on one of the most favorable geographies in human history. Jumping forward as the world's population rose across centuries, the places with the right mix of soil, water, climate, and access to the sea were the ones that could scale industry and power. The human story of expansion, from farm to factory to empire, has always been anchored in those physical realities. World population estimates underline the point. Roughly 200 million around year 1 CE, perhaps 500 million by 1500, and only around 2.3 billion by the middle of the 20th century. Numbers that show how dramatically the human footprint expanded and why land that could feed and move those people became priceless. Which brings us to why geography helps explain why the United States became dominant, and why that dominance is so durable. The US didn't win a lottery of luck, it inherited a strategic endowment, a massive interior with extraordinary agricultural potential, a linked system of navigable rivers, and a protected seaboard that rarely freezes. These are not trivial blessings. The Mississippi Basin, for instance, gives the country vast internal transport advantages that historically made moving grain and goods across the continent cheap and fast. That internal ease of trade is a structural advantage that helped underwrite industrial and military power for generations. Many writers have rhetorically argued the Mississippi Basin's internal waterways are unparalleled. And while that statement is more comparative than strictly literal, the point stands. America's inland transport geography is exceptional. A second part of the American edge is strategic insulation. Two wide oceans make it expensive for hostile powers to project force onto the continental US at scale. Combine that with productive farmland, energy resources, and deep ports, and you have a nation that can feed itself, export surplus, and maintain secure supply lines in peacetime and crisis. Contrast the US with a very different geographic puzzle, China. It sits on a long, productive coastline and a huge interior, but much of its sea access funnels through chokepoints, the most famous being the Strait of Malacca. Chinese leaders coined the Malacca Dilemma because a large portion of their oil and maritime traffic moves through narrow straits within reach of other navies. That vulnerability has driven Beijing to invest heavily in overland corridors, ports abroad, pipelines, and alternative routes. But geography still imposes limits and risk that the United States simply doesn't face in the same way. Africa shows a third archetype, enormous potential and frustrating constraints. The continent is vast, resource-rich, and young demographically, yet its rivers and coasts present obstacles for building integrated internal markets in the same way other continents did. The Congo River, for example, is enormously powerful, but interrupted by rapids and falls that make continuous inland navigation impossible. That breaks contiguous internal trade the way the Mississippi's flat run doesn't. Add coastlines with fewer natural deep harbors, and you begin to see structural headwinds to unified, export-led growth in some regions. Obstacles technology can mitigate, but not instantly erase. Russia is another instructive case. It's vast and resource-rich, but vast flat plains stretching westward have historically made defending the core difficult. Access to warm water ports has long been a strategic priority. which explains much Russian interest in the Mediterranean, the Black Sea, and increasingly the Arctic. Geography doesn't determine policy choices, but it constrains them in profound ways. And then there's Britain, an island with richly indented coasts that once made global seafaring and empire-building natural. Yet technological shifts, air power, nuclear weapons, and new industrial centers can blunt maritime advantage. Geography sets the starting line. Technology and politics run the race forward from there. So where does that leave the so-called decline of America narrative? Headlines love a dramatic arc. But if you strip the hype and ask strictly about the three practical pillars, can a country feed its population? Can it defend itself from large-scale invasion? And can it trade reliably with the world? The United States today continues to score very highly. Those are the structural criteria that persistently shape national power. Unless something fundamental about the geography itself changes, and physical geography changes only slowly. These structural advantages don't evaporate overnight. If this analysis is useful, please hit like and share. It helps this channel reach more people who care about the big picture forces shaping our world. Now, two important caveats. First, geography isn't destiny in a narrow deterministic sense. Institutions, technology, culture, leadership, and luck matter hugely. Japan and the Netherlands are classic examples of countries using smart policy and technology to amplify geographic advantages or compensate for limits. Second, many of the numbers you read online are shorthand or rhetorical, tempting and catchy but imprecise. For example, historical claims about navigable miles or percentages of oil transiting a single strait are useful to highlight risk, but the precise figures vary by year and methodology. I've aimed to keep the big picture truths while flagging where a number is a commonly quoted statistic rather than an immutable law. How to think about this as an investor or citizen? First, value land and logistics. Fertile, well-watered regions with secure access to trade routes are going to remain strategically important. Second, watch choke points and infrastructure. Pipelines, rail corridors, ports, and secure energy routes are real security levers. Third, remember that policy and innovation matter. Countries that can build institutions to turn geographic potential into resilient systems will outperform those that can't. Quick pause. What part of this surprised you most? Drop a comment below. I read and respond to the best ones, and your thoughts help shape future videos. To wrap up, geography is the scaffolding on which history builds. It doesn't write every line of the story, but it frames the plot. The United States benefits from a rare combination of productive land, internal transport, and oceanic protection that together create a deep, durable foundation of power. Other countries face geographic constraints that shape their strategies and vulnerabilities. And as we watch global power shift in certain ways, those land and water realities remain the slow, steady forces that often decide who wins and who loses. If you found this helpful, please like, subscribe, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss future deep dives. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.